Walk into a Korean barbecue restaurant and ignore the grill for a second. Look at the table next to you. Someone tears off a wide green leaf, drops grilled meat into it, maybe adds garlic, maybe a smear of sauce, folds it, eats it in one bite, and keeps talking like nothing important just happened. Now go sit at a sushi counter. Your sashimi comes out, cold and clean and expensive looking, and underneath the fish, there it is again. Same sharp leaf shape, same deep green, sometimes a purple-red underside. Most people barely register it. They think it is garnish, something decorative, something the chef added because the plate looked too empty. But that leaf has been feeding people, flavoring food, and showing up in medicine cabinets across Asia for centuries. And somehow the Western nutrition world mostly walked right past it. That alone would be strange. What makes it almost ridiculous is what sits inside the seed. Up to 64% omega-3. Not a decent plant source. Not surprisingly nutritious. The highest concentration ever measured in a plant oil. Higher than flax. Higher than chia. Higher than the glossy health food favorites sold as premium superfoods to people who have never heard this plant's name. So, now the mystery gets harder to ignore. How does a plant this powerful stay so invisible? How do you get a leaf eaten every week by hundreds of millions of people to disappear from Western nutritional memory? You do not need a conspiracy to make that happen. You need three things: a naming problem, a translation wall, and an economic system that notices fastest what it can package, patent, and sell back to people repeatedly. That is the real story here, because this plant was never hidden. In Korea, families have grown it for roughly 2,000 years. In Japan, it sits under sashimi so often that tourists look straight at it and still do not really see it. In China, dried leaves and seeds have lived in traditional medicine for generations, used for coughs, colds, digestive trouble, inflammation, nausea, skin problems, allergic reactions. The plant was not absent. It was present in fragments. In Korea, it came with one name. In Japan, another. In China, another. Then, Western botany gave it a Latin name that almost nobody uses at the dinner table. So instead of entering Western culture as one recognizable plant, it kept arriving as disconnected sightings. A leaf at Korean barbecue. A garnish under sushi. A medicinal herb in an Asian market. A specialty seed in a niche catalog. A footnote in a paper. A word people could not pronounce twice the same way. That kind of fragmentation does real damage. A plant without one stable identity gets split before it ever gets understood. Databases do not hold on to it cleanly. Cookbooks do not normalize it. Grocery stores do not teach people to look for it. Research gets scattered. Consumers never get the feeling that this is something they should know. So, a plant consumed by more people than many Western kitchen herbs stayed permanently foreign each time it appeared. And once that happens, erasure does not even need an enemy. It starts happening by default. But the history never disappeared. That part stayed stubborn. Ancient Chinese medical texts recorded its uses. In Korea, a royal physician named Hyo-jun spent years compiling one of the country's most important medical encyclopedias, finished in 1613. And this plant was in it. In Japan, cultivation spread so widely that households grew it not just for food, but for medicine and even lamp oil. Before electricity reached everywhere, people were pressing the seeds for light, food, medicine, oil. Once a plant starts serving all three roles, it stops being just an herb. It becomes household infrastructure, something you keep near the home because life keeps finding uses for it, something worth saving seed from, something grandmothers remember without needing a wellness podcast to explain why. And then you hit the most telling part of the whole story. The Korean Medical Encyclopedia that documented this plant in 1613 was not translated into English until 1999. 386 years. That is not a footnote. That is an information wall. On one side sat accumulated observation. use, memory, and medical writing stretching back across centuries. On the other side, Western nutrition science built its own hierarchy of important foods and medicinal plants, with huge parts of Asian knowledge still trapped behind language. So when people say, "Why didn't Western science notice this earlier?" the answer is not that nobody in Asia knew. Asia knew. The answer is that Western systems were not built to hear all knowledge equally. They heard what crossed the language barrier. They heard what got translated. They heard what got indexed. And later, they heard very loudly what industry had money to amplify. That is where fish oil enters the story. Once omega-3 became a major public health topic, especially after research in the 1970s made people pay attention to fatty acid profiles and heart health, Western markets locked onto a source that fit the machine perfectly: fish. Fish oil could be extracted, refined, standardized, purified, encapsulated, branded, segmented, and sold at every level of the market. Cheap capsules for the mass consumer. Cleaner formulations for the health-conscious buyer. Krill oil for the premium customer. Algae oil for the plant-based niche. The whole category scaled beautifully. By 2024, the global omega-3 supplement market had climbed to roughly $4 billion a year. And once a market like that gets built, it does more than sell products. It teaches people what omega-3 is supposed to look like. It teaches them where to look for it. It teaches them that value arrives in a bottle. Now, put this plant next to that system. Its seeds can be cold-pressed with simple tools. Its leaves are already edible. Its medicinal reputation predates modern supplements by centuries. And once it gets comfortable in the soil, it does something the repeat purchase economy hates. It comes back. Not politely, either. One plant can produce somewhere between 1,000 and 4,000 seeds. A very large share of those can germinate. The seeds can remain viable in the soil for years. Plant it once, let some seed heads mature, and next season the ground starts carrying the project for you. It returns in spring. Then it returns again. Then it starts behaving less like a crop and more like a resident. That threatens every link in the supplement supply chain. A self-seeding plant does not generate repeat seed sales. A backyard source of omega-3 does not need industrial processing to become useful. A crop that naturalizes itself reduces dependency, and anything that reduces dependency disrupts the number of places where somebody gets to charge you. That is not paranoia. That is business logic. What cannot be patented attracts less money. What attracts less money gets less research. What gets less research receives less attention. What receives less attention gets treated as marginal, no matter how useful it actually is. The gap in the literature shows that brutally. Search fish oil and omega-3 inches major medical databases, and you run into a wall of studies. Search this plant and the number drops off a cliff. The data is brutal. More than 15,000 studies tied to fish oil, omega-3, and only about 400 tied to Perilla, roughly 37-1. That ratio matters, not because it proves fish oil is superior. It does not. It matters because it shows where funding chose to concentrate. Research is not just a map of truth, it is also a map of incentives. Money flows toward products that can be controlled, protected, scaled, and sold at volume. A self-seeding plant with edible leaves and oil-rich seeds breaks that pattern too early. It starts giving too much away before the market gets enough hands on it. And still, enough research leaked through to make the neglect look even worse. In the early 2000s, Japanese researchers reported meaningful reductions in seasonal allergy symptoms using Perilla extracts, with some findings around the 50% range. Korean research found reductions in post-meal blood sugar, with one figure around 23%. Other work identified strong anti-inflammatory compounds, including rosmarinic acid, which this plant carries in unusually high levels for a culinary herb. Laboratory studies also explored cancer-related mechanisms involving compounds found in the leaves and seed chemistry. That does not mean one leaf replaces medicine. It means the old record was not talking nonsense. The plant had history behind it, chemistry behind it, and enough modern signal behind it to deserve far more attention than it got. Yet, Western awareness stayed almost embarrassingly low, and that is where the survival angle stops feeling like a side benefit and starts looking like the real reason this plant matters. Because unlike a supplement, it does not only exist after processing, it exists in the yard, in poor soil, in ordinary weather, in neglected corners, in family gardens where nobody is trying to optimize a spreadsheet. It grows across a broad climate range, roughly USDA zones 4 through 10. Once established, it tolerates dry spells better than many garden plants. People baby with expensive inputs. It does not need to be coddled into usefulness. It just needs a chance to get established once. That is a very different relationship from the one most people have with wellness products. You are not subscribing to it. You are not waiting for a shipment. You are not depending on a supply chain that stretches through factories, bottling lines, quality control labs, and retail markup. You put seed in the ground. That is where the whole tone of the story changes. The first year, maybe you pay attention. Maybe you water it while the roots are settling in. Maybe you clip a few leaves and taste them carefully because the flavor catches people off guard. Minty, yes, but not mint. Herbal, but sharper. Basil adjacent in one direction, anise-like in another. Bold enough to wrap around grilled meat and cut through fat. Distinct enough that once you recognize it, you start noticing how strange it is that so many people kept calling it garnish. Then the season moves on. Flowers form. Seed heads dry. A few stalks get left standing because the weather shifts or you get busy, or the garden stops being the center of your life for a few weeks. And next spring, the answer comes up through the soil. Seedlings near the fence. Seedlings along the warm edge of the bed. Seedlings in the place you forgot to clear. That is when the plant stops feeling like a purchase. It starts feeling like infrastructure, a leaf crop that returns, a medicinal herb that returns, a seed source that returns, a source of value that does not reset to zero every year. That is permanent food infrastructure. One decision made once can keep paying out in leaves, seed, and resilience for years. Not because you kept buying the system, but because the living thing kept doing what living things do when nobody interrupts them. Modern gardening culture does not talk enough about that kind of value. It talks about inputs, branded soils, fertilizers, amendments, seed starting kits, solutions sold aisle by aisle. There is a whole economy built on convincing people that every season begins at checkout. But a self-seeding plant breaks that rhythm. It carries memory in the soil. It narrows the distance between you and what you need. It keeps giving after the first transaction ends. And systems built on repetition do not celebrate things that end repetition. So no, this was never a story about Asia hiding a secret. The leaf was on the plate the whole time. The seeds were in the field. The knowledge was in the texts. The uses were in everyday life. What failed was not the plant. What failed was the system that decides what gets seen. A system built to notice what can be patented. A system built to reward what can be processed. A system built to fund what can be owned. A system built to teach consumers that nutrition becomes real only after it has been extracted, packaged, and sold back to them. Perilla never fit that model cleanly. It was too useful before processing, too generous after planting, too hard to lock down, too disruptive to repeat sales. And that, more than anything, explains the silence. Because the same traits that made it unattractive to the market are exactly the traits that make it powerful in real life. It feeds you. It reseeds itself. It stores concentrated value in the seed. It tolerates poor conditions. It asks less. It returns. Planting it is not just a gardening tip. It is a small act of independence. You take a plant that no corporation can fully own once it is naturalized in your soil. You let next year begin before this year is over. You choose a source of food and omega, 3 that does not need to pass through a bottle to become legitimate. And, little by little, season by season, you step outside a system that only knows how to teach value after value has been turned into a product. That is why this plant matters. Not because it was mysterious, because it was ignored. Not because it was weak, because it was disruptive. Not because Asia kept it secret, because the modern market had no elegant way to profit from something this self-sufficient. A leaf on the plate, a seed in the soil, a plant that comes back without asking to be bought again. That is not garnish. That is a blind spot in the modern nutrition economy. And once you see it, really see it, the question is no longer why Asia kept growing it. The question is why the rest of the world let a plant this useful sit in plain sight for this long without learning how to name it, grow it, and keep it close.